Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll go ahead and implement the VPC endpoint services. Now in order for the implementation to work, there are two primary parts that are involved. First one is we need to create the service provider site, get it ready. Then we have to create a service consumer site, get it ready. And then we have to connect both of them and test the connection. So this is the basic idea. So first what we'll do is we'll go ahead and create a EC2 instance at a service provider site and also associate it with a network load balancer. So let's quickly try it out. So I'll create a new EC2 instance in one of the new region. So let's go ahead and create it based on the Amazon Linux 2. We'll do a review and launch, and I'll quickly do a launch. All right. So let's just call this instance as a service provider. Let's do a save. Now along with this, till the time it is in the creation state, let's go to the security group and we'll allow one more port. So by default there is only port 22 that is allowed. Let's go ahead and open the security group in a newer tab and let's edit the inbound rule. Let's keep it simple. Since this is a demo, let's go ahead and allow all the traffic on 0000. I'll go ahead and save this. All right, great. So now once the instance is running, let's try and connect it via the EC2 connect. Perfect, we are connected. Let's switch to the root user and we'll go ahead and install the web server. So the web server that we'll be installing is Apache. So it is pretty straightforward. Once done, you can just go ahead and start the service. All right. So that's about it. So once you go back to the instance, you should be able to open up the default Apache page. Let's copy the IP. Let's paste it over here. So you should see the default page over here. Perfect. So our instance is created. The next step is to create a network load balancer. So let's go to the load balancer. Let's create a load balancer. The type would be network. So again, at this stage, if you have not worked with network load balancer, that is fine. I just wanted to give you a practical overview on how these things are connected. So the overall concept is better understood. So let's just call this load balancer as Endpoint NLB. We'll just use it as an internal load balancer. Let's associate it with all of the subnets over here. All right. And now here you see that whenever you create a network load balancer, you need to associate a target group. So currently we do not have a target group here. So let's go ahead and first create a target group here. So the target group, the target type would be instances. The port is 80, that is fine. Let's do a next. All right, so the target name, let's just call it as Endpoint target group. Let's go ahead and do a next. And we'll just select our instance with the name of service provider. All right, and let's go ahead and create a target group here. Perfect. So once the target group is created, you can just refresh this and select the target group here. So whenever the traffic on port 80 comes to the network load balancer, it will be sent to the EC2 instances that are part of this target group. Once then, you can go ahead and create a network load balancer. Perfect. So if I'll just quickly do a view load balancer, the network load balancer is in the provisioning state. It can take a little amount of time for it to be created. So till the time the network load balancer gets created, let's go ahead and also start to create our service consumer side architecture. So let's go to the EC2 instance. We'll go ahead and launch one more instance here. Let's go ahead and launch it in a different availability zone. So our service provider instance is in 1A. So ideally, the better way to demonstrate it would be to have multiple AWS accounts. However, most of us since would have a single AWS account, we are doing a practical based on single AWS account to just show how this practical flow would look like. Great. So let's go ahead and create it in a different availability zone. Let's do 1B. So I'll just use Amazon Linux 2. We'll use a different availability. Let's do a 1B. Let's do a review and launch. And we'll launch it with our key. All right, so now let's go ahead and name this as service consumer. Perfect. Now the next step is to create a new interface endpoint. Now since this consumer service is associated with the 1B region, so if you go to networking, it is associated with the availability zone 1B. For simplicity, let's just associate our interface endpoint with 1B region only. So for this, let's go to the VPC. We'll go to the endpoints. Let's create an endpoint. And now at this stage, whenever you go ahead and create an interface endpoint, you have three options here. You have a AWS services, you have find service by name, and you have a marketplace service. Now AWS service, we already know there are multiple AWS services that are available. However, for our use case, we do not want AWS service. In fact, we already have Apache server that is running. So we need a custom service type. So for that, you have to click on find service by name. So in such cases, what you have to do is, since this interface endpoint needs to be associated with a network load balancer, what you first need to do is you have to create a VPC endpoint service. So this service VPC endpoint needs to be created. So in order to do that, you can go to endpoint services here. You can click on create endpoint service, and within here, this endpoint service needs to be associated with a load balancer. So we have a network load balancer. So we'll associate our endpoint service with a network load balancer, and we'll go ahead and create this service. Perfect. All right. So our endpoint service is available. Now let's go to the interface endpoint. Let's create an endpoint. And within the find service by name, you'll have to go ahead and paste the name of the endpoint service. So if we'll quickly go to the endpoint service here, you have a service name. So this is the name that you need to copy. And now you have to go ahead and paste it within here. All right. Once then, you can go ahead and click on verify. It states that the service name is found, and you can also associate a security group here. Let's leave it default for the time being, and let's create an interface endpoint. Now, as soon as the interface endpoint is created, you see the status is pending acceptance. So from the endpoint service, so basically the architecture is between a service provider and a consumer. So when a consumer creates a interface endpoint and he associates it with the service name provided by the service provider, before the connection gets established, the endpoint service will have to accept the connection. So currently from the endpoint service, you can go ahead and accept this connection request. So it can take a minute for the state to be changed. So till the time the state changes, let's go back to the endpoint. Let's go to the security group and let's change the security group to allow the HTTP traffic on port 80. So within the inbound rules, let's change this. Let's add a rule for port 80. And we'll just add a 0000 just for simplicity of the time being. So now if we go to endpoint services, under the endpoint connection, it is still pending. Let's try to refresh. Yes, it is still pending. So let's do one thing. Let's quickly wait for a moment here for the state to be changed. So if I refresh, now you see the state is available. Perfect. So now what we need to do from our service consumer instance, we have to send the traffic to the interface endpoint. And if things are working perfectly, we should see the HTML page associated with this. All right. So let's do one thing. Let's go to the instance. We'll connect to the service consumer instance here. And for the traffic to be sent to the interface endpoint, let's go ahead and copy the DNS associated with the interface endpoint. So I'll copy the first one here. And let's do a curl. Let's do a Control V to paste the DNS. And if I press enter, as expected, you are basically seeing the HTML contents. You see, here you can see you have a test page, something similar to the one within the browser. So I hope with this at a high level overview, you understood the architecture flow in terms of the VPC endpoint services. And with this, we'll conclude today's video.